This is pro cyclist Harry Sweeny, and you're listening to Choose the Hard Way podcast. This is the first time I've ever done pre-season altitude before, because usually I live at about 1,300 meters, so it's not descending as much. It's only about 300 meters down to Spain. But yeah, now I'm staying up at 2,000, and I've been up here for nearly 5 weeks now. So it's been cold. Bits and pieces have been really, really cold with snow, but for the most part, it's been really good up in Andorra. Lots of sun, so can't complain.
Yeah, I'm really curious. In one of your recent videos, I saw you were using a pulse oximeter. And are you using that for altitude adaptation, or do you also use that to calibrate rest and recovery?
Yeah, it's actually only rest and recovery. It's pretty much a metric that I use to see when I need recovery days. I mean, for me personally, like living already at 1,400 provides adaptations already, particularly because it's chronic, like I live at 1,400. It's not like I'm spending short periods of time there. So yeah, my SpO2 doesn't really drop that much. So when I'm at altitude every single day, I'm monitoring my levels. And when it really does drop, usually coincides with when I wake up quite tired. And it's just an indicator that, yeah, I need a recovery day, or maybe I shouldn't go as hard that day. And it's, yeah, way, way more important up here than it is when I am not at altitude.
And how much of a deviation are you looking for that would indicate that you're actually more fatigued than you would like to be?
Yeah, so at 2,000 meters, I'm anywhere between, when I'm not tired, anywhere between 94 and 96. But then if I needed a recovery day, it would be below 93, which is incredibly rare. So
Right.
most of the time, it's like a monitor where I it's a metric that I use basically, and my recovery days are always programmed. But if in the event that I woke up and it was 93, it'd be like straight away a recovery day.
Yeah, always. And in addition to that, I'm curious, how much are you paying attention to how you actually feel or the sensations that you have in your body, plus the data that you're looking at to make those kinds of decisions?
Almost entirely off field, to be honest. The metrics are really there for the coaches, for example. If I looked at metrics at altitude, my HRV is nearly halved, especially in the cold weather. I think for me personally, during the seasons, it changes quite a lot. Like if I was at sea level, I would be in summer about 160, and then in winter, maybe 100. But then when I'm at altitude, with a combination of the cold weather, it's well below 100 almost every day. But then if I went down to sea level tomorrow, it would double.
Okay. Yeah, this is really getting in the weeds, and you will be able to tell from this question how closely I have been following your content. So, in the same video recently where you had the pulse oximeter, and like I zeroed in on that because I had never seen someone use that as a metric for calibrating rest and recovery. Then I went into PubMed. I started doing research. I was like, oh, this is really interesting.
Yeah.
Next thing you know, I'm on Amazon. I was trying to find the exact model you had, which I don't think is available in the United States, but I found some alternatives. So I was really curious about it. I paused and I took a look at your training peaks and I looked at your HRV number. And in that video, it was in the 50s. And then
Yeah.
I went and looked at some of the data that EF had published. I think Whoop did a study during the Tour de France looking at HRV and other data from some athletes on the team. And it looked like the range during the tour, at the high end at the beginning of the tour, I believe the median HRV for the riders on the tour team was 140 or maybe 144.
Yeah.
And then on the first rest day, it was around 70. I saw yours at 57, and I thought, number one, like, was that actually your HRV that day? And number two, were you just totally wrecked?
No, so this is all of the data was as it was, like exactly how it was recorded, and that's actually why I primarily go off feel when I'm at altitude, because
Right.
I think a lot of it, for me personally, when it's seasonal changes, which most people it is, it's also good to look at it with, yeah, like not exact science where like your HRV is low one day, maybe I was really cold the day before, but it
Right.
doesn't necessarily mean that I can't train hard if it's low that day. So for me to see 50 in winter at 2000 meters and training hard is not really alarming because like the last race I went to in Bessèges, for example, I had a travel day and I drove 5 hours, but then I woke up and it was 135. So it's one of those
Whoa.
things for me where, yeah, it for me, it'll change a lot depending on feel. And honestly, a really interesting trend for me is during a grand tour, the lower my HRV gets also coincides with the better that I feel on the bike, usually because I have a capacity to adapt to the load that I have, even though I'm also fatiguing as well. And that seems to override the fatigue.
Right. And again, this is part of what I really enjoy about the content that you're putting out and what you're showing us about life as a pro cyclist, both from a lifestyle point of view, which we'll get into, as well as tactically from a training and implementation point of view. It's just very fascinating to me, see what you're finding that works and how you're ingesting and interpreting data. And as I was sharing with you before we started recording, my startup, the Better Lab, is really oriented around helping aging athletes optimize their rest and recovery using science-backed methods. And, one of the things that we've noticed is that almost all of us at this point, we're using a huge variety of devices, whether it's a Whoop and or I have a Garmin that I don't actually check this daily, but I do sometimes look at longitudinal data around HRV. And as you noted, you sometimes are seeing some of your best performances when your HRV is the lowest. And just in doing some research for this, I listened to your one of your podcasts with Jack Burke, and it sounded like part of what you've discovered about your own physiology is just that. It sounds like to get maximal performance at a 1 day race or in a grand tour, you almost have to do block periodization where you're doing a very hard week leading up to beginning a grand tour or a few days out from like a classic, which is a bit unusual compared to what amateurs
Yeah.
perhaps are used to hearing about.
I think the key difference there is a lot of amateurs, I think, and also the basis for a lot of biometric tracking is, I would say, getting the most adaptation possible per amount of exertion that you have. But for us, that's not exactly the case because we have like essentially unlimited exertion if you can recover from it. So for me, yeah, it's trial and error, but I've never really got to the point where I've gotten such a big hole or even really got in a hole that I had to have rest to come out of. It's always been the more I do, the better I get. And I haven't really found a caveat to that really yet. I mean, the stage 20 of the Vuelta, like the last road stage, was the best power I've ever done ever. And it was, yeah, after 3 weeks of racing, and I probably woke up to like 35 HRVs that day.
Wow, that's wild. Were you like that earlier in your career? Like when you look back at your historical data, has that always been the case?
Yeah, it was always the case from very early on where I would follow what you would call a typical taper plan, and I would always feel rubbish. And then the first 3 days of any tour, I'd be horrible. Like, I almost wouldn't be at the level of being a pro, I would feel like if being the first person dropped. But then a week into any tour, like Dauphiné, for example, I would be 10 times better than I was on the first day. And then it sort of led me to training a little bit differently and like trying to push the limits of what I thought a taper would really be. And during that time, I discovered that actually I can do a 3 hour hard ride with sprints and 5 minute efforts before the day before a big race, and it will make me better, not worse.
Did having that realization about your personal physiology, obviously you've made some adjustments about how you prepare for these events. Having the ability to go harder the deeper you get into a 3 week race, seems like an uncommon and an extremely highly desirable quality for a professional cyclist to have. So when you when you realize that, and I am curious, how did you come to this realization based on your own observations? Was it in conjunction with the high performance team and coaches you were working with? And then what did you do with that information to start testing the hypothesis like, hey, maybe I need to train harder coming into these races?
Yeah, well, honestly, it's really simple. Like the implementation is just having big balls to do it, really. Like it's mentally really I would not challenging, but it really makes you question yourself the day before Milan San Remo, for example. If you're doing 3 5 minute efforts at like 460 watts, you're like, why am I doing this? But then when it works and you finally unlock that what you feel you have in there 3 weeks into a tour, for example, and you can do that on a 1 day race, then after you do it once, you have confidence in it. But it really is in conjunction with a coach going, we're going to have to try it. Like the only way to check is to try. And yeah, maybe for the first time, it's not the best before a monument, but you have to start somewhere.
Yeah, in some ways, that's actually the only way to test into something like that, because you need to have the physical stimulus, obviously, and then in addition to that, kind of you have to go through that psychological discomfort of, I'm doing something that physically seems a bit counterintuitive relative to conventional wisdom around training or preparing for a race. Like after you did those sessions that first time, did you have any doubt about whether it was going to work before you actually got on the start line? Or were you like,
A
well, let's just
little
see how
bit,
it
yeah.
goes? Yeah.
I definitely had a little bit, but I'd also had enough times in 1 day races where I'd trained perfectly up until the week before, and then I got onto the start line and just felt like absolute rubbish for 6 hours that
Yeah.
I kind of felt like I didn't really have anything to lose. And now I feel like just really the last year I've kind of got into the sweet spot of what I need to do before a race. But the biggest thing for me now is not worrying about whether I've put too much fatigue on my body. It's whether I've put too much fatigue on my brain and my mental state essentially leading up to it. Because I
Right.
genuinely feel like I could do 30-hour weeks leading up to a grand tour and I would be there the fittest that I've ever been. But mentally, I might not be able to even switch on for a single day. But if I did 20-hour weeks leading up to a grand tour, I wouldn't be as fit, but maybe I can switch on, really switch on for 10 days of that. And then I would be twice the rider, you know?
Yeah. Harry, I would love to explore this a bit more. So, as you know, and probably most of the people listening know, our body processes all stress the same way. It all increases cortisol levels, whether it's us worrying or being anxious about something, or it's us going out and, in your case, doing a 30-hour week. Your body kind of reads that the same. So, on the mental side of things, what do you do to stay calm, cool, at the appropriate level of arousal going into something like a grand tour, a 1 day monument, where it's not just about performing on that day? It, if you zoom out, it's also, that's going to determine like, hey, what kind of contract do you potentially get the next time you sit down and negotiate, uh, those types of things.
Yeah, I definitely find it more difficult to do that for a 1 day race because there's no stage two. It's just if you screw it up that day, it's screwed up and you can't remedy anything. So a lot of it for me is not so much figuring out how I need to feel. It's actually just about writing very specific goals that are, for lack of a better term, achievable and measurable. And like just essentially just being focused on the process of that goal. So like when I train, I'm not training for a specific race, but I'm training through the process. So I'm focused on the process of today I need to do 500 for 5 minutes and then tomorrow recover and then again. So then for me to work best mentally, it's that I need to then have goals where it's like at this corner, I'm top 30, so that then at this corner, I can be first there, and then I can drop off my teammate who needs to attack there. And it's very rigid and very structured. And for me, it takes out any room for error in what I'm actually trying to do. Like everything that I've done leading up to the race is what will make me feel good on the day. So regardless of how I feel, it's almost not in the equation for the race day. Like that's in the equation for the race day is the goals that I have and the job I have to do, and the rest of it is noise.
And when you think about those process goals, like on race day, for example, does your list have do you get as reductive and as step by step as like, hey, making sure breakfast is exactly what I need to have this day. I'm ready for the team bus 10 minutes before I don't know. Like, what are some of the types of things you're doing from a process point of view?
A lot of it is just muscle memory from breakfast onwards. Like it's pretty much dialed in that you eat very similar most days, particularly on race days. So that to me isn't really as much of an issue. It's really like getting onto the bus, focusing for the meeting for 20 minutes, then switching off. And particularly for a long race, it is important to be able to switch back off because you have your meeting an hour before the start of San Remo. Your job is not going to be for another 7 hours. So you can't just be like razor focused the entire time. And that for me is really what I've worked on is actually being able to switch on and switch off because without being able to switch on or switch off, you can't like have that real peak of hyper focus because you're just at a real mellow the whole time. So yeah, that's sort of like what I've discovered in my career is that the mental training is to allow you to have a peak and a trough, not just be like this the whole day.
Yeah, it's interesting because with something like San Remo, for example, there, as you noted, there are these moments when like the race is on as it relates to your job, there's specific tasks and responsibilities. And at those moments, you have to execute or the really things potentially fall apart for the team. Equally, if we're thinking about the brain's default mode network and what you're doing potentially unconsciously when you're in the Peloton for 7 hours, which is incredibly dangerous. And like, just in this, at this unconscious, subconscious level, you have to navigate hazards constantly that someone who's not inoculated to that level of stress and precise motor movement, like you drop them into that and they'd panic probably. So it's a really interesting thing. So when you're like let's say you're in a race like San Remo, you're at a tour stage, do you tend to go into or outside of your body during the moments when the race is on and it's time for you to execute and things are getting hard?
In the moment, I would say I'm very internal with focused on exactly what I can do. I don't think yeah, I mean, there's very external parts, but for example, in the finish where I'm coming to do my job in the final, I'm not going to be able to realize how many fans are on the road or the screaming. It's very much with the blinders on, but you can still react in an instant to someone crashing or avoid something or get a bottle that you need. So I would say that it's not internal or external. It's a mix where you really learn to focus on exactly what you need and nothing else.
It's been interesting in the last 2 years how much of the conventional wisdom of the past decade has started to get turned over inside of pro cycling and the world of high performance and endurance sports. So I think I read an article just this week that it's like the 5 millionth article I've read about high carb and like, how it's transforming pro cycling. 120's the new 110, whatever. People are like, they're trying to get up to 200 grams of carb per hour. Potentially that's the edge that some athletes who seem to be exceptional in a lot of ways, that might be one of the edges that they have, is they can just like process and metabolize carb at a higher rate than other people. So, all of the metabolic flexibility, fasted training stuff that just a decade ago Ineos Sky. That was, that was their secret weapon. Now we have heat training. We everybody's on 165, 160 millimeter cranks now. It's just wild to me that human civilization is this advanced, and things that were taken as doctrine a decade ago are just
Yeah.
getting flipped over and like they're gone. Is there anything like that is happening today that, if you look into the future in the next couple of years, that you feel like we're going to be doing completely differently potentially?
I think a lot of it will come down to the mental aspect because I really feel like since I've come in, yes, there's been developments in nutrition, but essentially since I've been pro, I've really been racing on 150 grams of carbs an hour. Like it's not like I came in and I was still doing like fasted rides and 50 grams of carbs in a race. So I think a lot of the later stuff that I think will come out will be about maximizing riders' mental states more so than just like you're going to this race because it's good for you whether you want to or not. Because I think teams are sort of cottoning on to that's not really a thing that works for anyone.
Yeah. And just to shift gears a little bit, what led you to decide to go public and share your experience with neurodivergence and autism?
Uh, I think I sort of thought that there was no one else really apart from JV that had really gone public with it. You know, like when I first signed for the team was quite early on with my last year at Lotto. And it was at the time when I was reading JV's book. I mean, I was talking to the team and I thought, all right, I'm going to read JV's book and see like what he's like, whether it's a team that I'd like to ride for. And yeah, I read this book and he briefly mentions at the end that he had Asperger's, and then it was sort of something that I was mulling over talking about for quite a while. And JV had a contact in the media and he just said, someone's doing an article on it. Would you like to be a part of it? And I pretty much didn't give it a second thought. I just said that, yeah, sure, I'd love to. And that was all the thought that I gave to it, really.
And would you mind sharing your experience with how, as an adult, you arrived at this diagnosis and how that happened for you?
Yeah, I think for me, there was a lot of small things that I never really pegged to have been me being on the spectrum. It was all just like a few weird intricacies that I wouldn't like how shirts felt on my shoulders, or like people wouldn't understand if I kept arguing and arguing for hours about the same thing. And I think there was a few people that mentioned things to me, like close friends and family, and yeah, obviously, like we work with psychologists all the time, so there's not really any stigma around seeing a psychologist in the professional sporting world. So I just went to see a psychologist when I would have been 20 two, maybe roughly around then. And I just went to a psychologist and spoke to them. And yeah, they said, yeah, it'll take 3 sessions or something to diagnose you because usually adults that are undiagnosed at a later age are more difficult to figure out the nuances about a diagnosis. But then, yeah, within 30 minutes, she was like, yeah, you're definitely on the spectrum. And then I just walked out.
Right. And in the Escape Collective story where you shared about this experience, there's a quote from you. You said, "I believe that the sole reason I became a professional cyclist is because of how my brain is wired." What does that what does that mean to you?
I think, yeah, ever since a young age, I've always been drawn to endurance sports. I mean, I wanted to become a professional soccer player until I realized I didn't have the skills for it. But then when I really got into endurance sport, I was just hooked on, I think, the repetitiveness and the fact that you have 100% control over what you're doing. You control every parameter of your training, and I almost think that the obsessive nature of it is what really drew me in.
And I'm curious, I know I've shared with you there's neurodivergence in my family, and as I learn about different aspects of neurodivergence, and about the spectrum, I'm curious if you think endurance sports for people on the spectrum. Do you think that part of it is related to stimming at all?
Yeah, I think it's a coping mechanism to some degree. Like I think people initially get into it because they want to do sport and then they stay in it because it's calming and it's routine and it it is just it becomes their life essentially. And I think that that is yeah, I just think it's them. Like you become what you do every day and it's something that soothes you and something you have control over and something that you can practice and get better at. And I think that the obsessive nature of it is addicting.
And for you and your personal experience of being someone on the spectrum, is obsession and like having an obsessive interest in topics, or is it actual clinical OCD, or like how does it show up for you?
No, I'm definitely not OCD. I think for me, it's just obsessive things that I'm interested in, for example. Um, like if I want to figure out why I have an injury, I could obsess over every different intricacy of my bike fit for 5 days and figure out a solution. I think it's really specific things that I'm interested in that I can spend hours and hours on just fixated.
Right. And as you mentioned, as a professional athlete, you've had the opportunity and you work with sports psychologists. What is that work like, and what do you work on?
It's draining, to be honest. It's really, when I first got into it, I was hesitant. I thought like, what can someone like tell me about myself, really? And I think it was talking to someone and realizing that a lot of the time I was in a mental state where I wasn't switched on and I wasn't really switched off. Like I went through a lot of the stages of the Tour de France my first year where I would say I was mentally switched off and I think that my physiology allowed me to be switched off. I think I had like enough of a physiological talent that I could go through a stage switched off, for example, and make it through. And I think that enabled me to think that that mental state was normal, where I wouldn't have to really put energy into switching my brain on to do my job. I could just do it without really having to try to do it. And I needed somebody to tell me basically that like that level of mental arousal is incredibly low and not normal, and that I could work on it and drastically increase my performance.
How have you worked on it?
Essentially setting goals and the biggest thing for me is taking note of how I switch off and when I switch off, because it's not just a matter of saying like your mental arousal's low, you should want to race more or you should do this. It's actually almost conserving your mental state when you don't need to be expending it so that you can have that peak. So for me, it was like spend 10 minutes a day where you're actually doing nothing, where like you're just sitting there, you're not on your phone, you're not reading a book, you're not playing a game, you're actually just doing nothing. And for me, it's like incredibly difficult to do. So like I would say for me, doing nothing is like going for a hike. Like I would, if someone asked me what I do to relax, it would have been like I got back from 5 hours of training, I quickly cooked a nice lunch, and then I went out on an hour hike, and then like I went shopping, and that would be like me doing nothing. And it took the psychologist to be like that. You're actually doing a lot of stuff. You're putting like a lot of mental stress on your body, and I even still struggle with it now as doing nothing, but I have to it's part of my recovery now. Is like I really have to just sit on the couch and do nothing.
So is that part of your routine every day? Is that like baked in? I'm going to have this 10 minutes of, I'm just going to be here and I'm going to be present to whatever pops up, or is it more
Uh
directed than that?
it's initially it was I would put like some low frequency music in and I would just sit there and try and not think about anything and like let the thoughts come through your mind and out. And it's sort of over time that wasn't really sustainable to me because I would just sit there and I like a million things would come into my head. So now it's sort of I get ready for bed and I might read a book for an hour. And to me, reading a book is as close to doing nothing as I can really ever get now.
Yeah, so it's a practice that's evolved over time, and you're finding what works for you and how to get that down regulation so that you can then apply it when you're in a race or whenever you need to control your level of arousal to increase it or decrease it.
Yeah, I think I didn't really realize the amount of mental energy that I could always just expend without, yeah, without having a drop. Like I could just be at a semi state of mental arousal forever, and I would never have the peak because I never had the mental energy, I guess you could say, to get there. But now I really put an emphasis as it's as just as important as having a good recovery meal is that I actually sit on the couch and I don't go ski for the whole afternoon and still say that I did nothing. You know, like there's a lot of things that I really love to do that I tell myself no now.
That's incredible. Thanks for sharing that. So in order to reach the highest heights and to peak and to go to a higher level, you have to actively find ways to conserve your energy and turn it off, or you can't actually get to
A
that high
hundred
level.
percent. If I didn't care about how it was racing or like getting better, essentially, I could fill my day with an incredible amount of stuff. Like I'd wake up and ski all morning, ride all day, and eat when I could and sleep at 11 p.m. and repeat every day and then ski all day on recovery days. And I think like a lot of it is realizing that just because I enjoy it and it's good for my mental state doesn't necessarily mean it's good for my performance and adaptation. And I think it's easy for me to convince myself like it makes me happy, so I should do it. But a lot of it is detrimental. Like if I have a 30-hour week and I'm not really recovering on a recovery day, it's detrimental to my performance. And a lot of it is actually coming to terms with the fact that maybe I can't go and hike in the afternoon and stay up or like wake up at 5 a.m. to see sunrise and go camping on the weekend because it is actually not good for my performance. So yeah, I think a big part of it is telling myself no.
Something that people who follow professional sports and perhaps people who follow professional cycling in particular, I don't think they give a lot of thought to how intense the interpersonal dynamics might be. You're on a team, and you're at home in Andorra or you're going to training camp. Sometimes you're on your own or with Jacob, your filmer and friend, doing cool stuff. A lot of the time, you're in tight quarters with people in potentially really intense situations, and you're also doing a ton of travel, and you're just in new locations constantly. As you've gone through this process of working with sports psychologists and learning to manage arousal, downregulate, and navigate your experience as someone who is on the spectrum, how has this showed up, or how has it informed your interpersonal relationships with teammates and the social side of what you do, which is like a huge part of being a pro athlete?
I think I'm lucky for one with EF, everyone gets on incredibly well. Um, but a big thing for me is controlling things that I can control. For example, like if I know that I'm going to have some real bitch of a travel days coming up, I'll do everything I can to streamline what my flights look like when I arrive, that I can go straight to a hotel or that I have my car parked somewhere that I can hop straight off the plane and drive home straight away. And a lot of it for me is making sure that I do those small things so that when you get there, you're not bitter that you haven't done better and you're in a mood that's good enough that you can interact with people. But I think a lot of the guys on the team I get along with super well and they actually boost my mood as opposed to the opposite. So it's not really something that it detracts at all, like having to spend a lot of time with them. But that said, it is incredibly important when you're doing a grand tour, for example, that you're with someone in the room that you really click with and that you're they don't do things that like grade up against you that after 3 weeks you're just like, get me out of here.
um, so you've shared some of the techniques that you're using from a travel logistics standpoint, just day to day with the frequency of travel that you're doing. And again, I think most people listening to this podcast are probably aware of the fact that, professional cycling's when you're on the road, you're not always in five-star accommodations, to put it mildly. So,
No.
yeah. So, like, what do you do to make yourself comfortable and to make sure you're getting the rest and recovery that you need to perform at your highest level? Like, do you bring your own pillow, white noise machine? Like, what do you like to do to make it environmentally as relaxing as possible?
Yeah, I think I've seen a lot of extremes. I've seen air purifiers go on buses. I've seen mattresses, pillows, bed sheets. People do like some really extreme stuff to make it feel like home. But for me, the most important is something that I can repeat at every hotel that doesn't detract. So the team brings a pillow. I have I have the exact same, like, for example, skincare. I have the exact same skincare in miniature versions at a race that I have at home. And that's as close to me that I'll get to anything of, yeah, any semblance of actually being at home. And I think the more that you add on to that is just more complexity that you're not necessarily going to repeat, and you actually probably won't get the return that you're looking for. So it's really simple for me. And yeah, I don't want to complicate it more than that.
Is there anything that you like to do in your day, just behaviorally, that you repeat when you're out on the road? Just as a for example, I've been fascinated for so long by the rumors of Primoz Roglic is like going out and running before tour stages, which I don't believe
Huh.
to be true. I think just digging into it a bit, that seems like perhaps that was not the case. But is there anything you like
Um,
to do, like on a grand tour when you're out on the road?
I
Run a run
really,
a 10K or
I really like having time to myself. So sometimes I might like, if it depends. If your roommate has the same soigneur as you alternate for massage. So you might get an hour where you can just lay and read and you don't have to talk to anyone or you don't have to see anyone. But sometimes they have a different soigneur, so you might have massage at the same time, and then you have an hour with your soigneur, but then you're back in the room with them. So for me, sometimes if I really do just need to completely decompress, is I might skip massage for a day and just lay in my room and just really switch off and listen to music for an hour or something like that.
when you think back to when you were a kid and at some point you start to have this dream of being a professional athlete, what did you imagine being a professional athlete would be like?
Honestly, I don't think I ever got that far. I was so focused on the goal of becoming pro that I honestly, it wasn't until the day that I moved to Nice when I had signed my pro contract and it was my first month pro that I was like, fuck, this is what being a pro is like. I'm in an apartment, I'm in a brand new country, I'm in a brand new apartment. I don't know anybody in this country apart from one teammate. I can't speak the language. And I had a breakdown. I was like, what am I doing here? And that for me was the first time I'd ever thought about what being a pro would be like.
How did you navigate past that moment and start to get comfortable?
I called my parents and I said, I don't know if I actually even want to be a pro. Um, I cried on the phone to them, I reckon, for 30 minutes. And then the next day, I was like, I'd had 10 things written out about how I was going to fix the problems I had, like learn the language. It was during COVID, so I couldn't really meet people. So what I was doing is I would every day from my apartment, I would hop on my skateboard and I would, because I used to skate when I was a kid in Australia. So I was like, I'm going to buy a skateboard. Bought a skateboard. I would train all day, and then in the afternoon after I ate, I would skate down to the beach along the promenade, and I would skate up and down the beach and bump into a few people, meet some English people, and then I eventually met some people that lived there. So then I had someone to go out for dinner with, and then someone to like learn the language a bit with. And I basically built my life from scratch in a different country. And now that feeling of going to a new place and essentially having nothing is like one of the feelings that I almost crave now. Like when I moved from Nice to Andorra, the first day I was here, I just loved it. I was like, I know a few people here, but I don't know the language. I don't know the area, and discovering that from scratch has now become something that I search for.
What do you like about that? Is it the feeling of dislocation, being anonymous, just discovering new things?
Honestly, I don't know. I think it's the sense of adventure. I remember when I first flew from Australia to Belgium and found Europe for the first time, I remember being terrified that I didn't know my way back home and that I could only ride 5 minutes up the road and back to the accommodation so I didn't get lost. And I think that feeling is so foreign for us, particularly for Australians. Like you don't really go overseas that often, particularly like where I grew up. Most of my friends still live in the city that we grew up in. And I think that feeling of being able to like do anything and become anyone was really intoxicating almost. Like I felt that I could move somewhere and I could have a completely different life. And that essentially is what spurred me to move to Andorra. I just woke up one morning and I was like, I want to change my life. I want to go somewhere different. And I moved, and it's just a feeling of elation almost, as like being able to just go anywhere. And that obviously comes from a really privileged background. Like not a lot of people in their jobs can just choose a country to live in. But I think we, particularly in pro cycling, have that luxury, and I enjoy making the most of it, I guess.
And it sounds like that initial experience of showing up in Europe, having this feeling of dislocation, navigating through, as you said, being lonely, being a stranger in a new place, that kind of set the stage for you to then start to embrace something that was not a great feeling at first. And I'm curious about when you actually get to professional racing, did you have any, or have you had any moments or performances doing your job within the team that have opened your eyes to, hey, there's something possible for me at an even higher level than potentially I realized about myself? Have you had any just performances that have opened your
Yeah,
eyes to a higher level?
a few times. I think particularly early on in my career, it was easier for me to switch on to do my job perfectly for someone else than it would be if you told me to race for myself. And I think in a few of those moments, I would switch on and do my job for someone else, but then they might get dropped in the race before I did. And then I was the only one left after I helped them. And it sort of made me question why I would perform better for someone else, and like why I perform personally on a day I'm working for someone else and if I had the chance to go for myself. And that's what sort of gave me the realization that mentally I wasn't there on other days. And I think that progression of seeing how deep I could go in aid of someone else is what made me realize that I would have more to give if I could figure out how to do that for myself.
What have been your favorite moments in racing?
I think the one that stands out where I actually really thought that for the first time was when I was on Lotto under 23 team, and I was pretty much like the domestique for the team. I wouldn't say I was anything special that year. Like obviously I had good performances, but I never once rode for myself that entire year. And I signed pro for, it must have been in August I signed pro, or maybe July, to go to Caleb's lead out train, but nothing more. Like I was just a lead out guy. And then in Lombardia that year, so later on in the year, Piccolo Lombardia, I basically like got the opportunity to ride for myself and I won. And it was completely the opposite of like what the team had signed me to do. And I just remember thinking like, this is the first time that I've ridden for myself and the first time that I've had a result like this. And it's the first time I've mentally switched on this year, like really to that degree, and I can perform like this. And I think it unlocked a part of me that it's taken up until now to really channel into something that I can use that wasn't just like dumb luck that that day I switched on.
What did it make you think might be possible that you hadn't done yet, or what might be possible for you in the future?
Well, I think it was that I initially was just like, I'm not just a sprint lead out guy. Like I could do pretty much anything in aid of someone plus ride for myself. And I think that was a lot of my frustration when I developed further in Lotto is that I felt that I could do more, but I never really got the chance to because from their perspective, it's risky to take a chance on someone that hasn't proved themselves. But at the same time, I I felt that I'd proved myself a lot with the work that I was doing as a domestique. And yeah, this year or last year, sorry, with EF, I got that chance at Luxembourg. They just said like, you're flying after the Vuelta, you're going to be the leader at Luxembourg, and that was really the first time where I entered a race thinking like I have to really switch on here. And I would say it went really well for what I was expecting and considering the field that was there. And that's something that I would put that separate to my job that they signed me for. I think I've really been signed as a domestique where I am reliable to drop off someone at any point in the race, even in the final, in any terrain, basically. And then this is kind of like a side project for me where I'm like developing myself as my own rider in my own right.
Do you have a I mean, as you said, your job's to drop off people no matter what type of terrain, no matter what type of race. Do you have a favorite?
I do really like the Ardennes. I think that's at the moment what really suits me is the hard all day type of racing. But at the same time, I would really like to explore the Ardennes, sorry, the Flemish classics a little bit more, but they also require a lot of dedication in learning the route more so than what Liège does, because I would describe Flanders as a race where you can't make a mistake and fix it, whereas I think Liège, if you have the legs, you can really fix a mistake that you've made.
What kind of skills have you had to learn over the course of your pro career that did anything seem daunting at the outset as you got to this level that you're at in Europe? And
100%. Like what I remember when I landed in Belgium the first time and we were doing a 180 man race on roads that I could almost lay across and touch both sides. And it comes from Australia where you're riding on like a 4 lane road with 30 people. And I was terrified. I actually remember thinking the first day I got there, like I've made a huge mistake. Like, why am I doing this? And that has become something that I thrive in the chaos of. I think initially it terrified me, and obviously there's moments where I'm still terrified, like if it's dangerous. But for the most part, that moving through the bunch and riding shoulder to shoulder with someone is what I've really worked on to the point where now it's a strength instead of something that I hated doing.
is I don't know if you would want to talk about this, but is there anything similarly now that is not an aspect of professional cycling that you love that might become a thing in the future? Is there anything that's particularly daunting that you do in your current role?
Not really. I think the most daunting thing for me is not necessarily what other riders do, but more the course and dangers on the course. I think the mind that every professional athlete has is that they're pushing it to the absolute limit. And for me, it's where I get scared is where pushing it to the limit has very bad consequences as opposed to like a course where you could say it's safer and you can push it to the limits in a without risking as much. And I think it that is getting a lot better, particularly with the work of Adam Hansen and the CPA, that riders find themselves in, I would say, less life-threatening situations uh, in a race as before, because I think it's also become so much more competitive than it has been in the past, where you used to have like gentlemen's agreements and like Mario Cipollini could like raise his arms and slow down the whole bunch when danger's coming. But now you hear danger in the radio and the entire peloton goes 10 kilometers an hour faster to be the first one to get to the dangerous part to then be safe. So it's really changed in that way. And I think that's why a lot of the older guys are sort of starting to get out of the sport.
I'm really curious for someone like you. You've got an awesome YouTube channel. You're basically a professional chef. You have a laundry machine in your kitchen, I think, which I think is super cool. Um, whose content within professional cycling do you enjoy and follow, if anyone?
Honestly, I don't follow anyone. I think that's sort of like why I started it is was mainly actually something that I thought about trying to do that was it was I wanted to do something productive when I was doing my nothing time. And that sort of spiraled a bit out of control to something that actually became very, very popular. But I wanted to do something productive when I was laying in bed, basically, or being up at altitude. And I thought, oh, maybe I can edit videos. But obviously, over the time, I figured out that there's a rabbit hole that you could spend years in making things better and filming this and filming that. Um, but yeah, I don't really watch anyone else, and that was sort of like the niche that I thought there was, is that no one in the peloton made good videos at that time that people could watch and actually see behind the scenes that wasn't super polished.
What's your vision for where you want to take that storytelling now, or you just kind of let your muse take you wherever it goes?
Yeah, I've thought I think it really has the potential to be something massive. I think if I say Jacob just became part of the channel and wasn't behind the camera and I paid someone to film, they could follow you around and make a video for every day of the week that you were training. And I think the thing that stops it from being bigger than it already is that I don't upload consistently enough because I really, since I started doing it, really prioritize my time, that my real job as being a pro cyclist, not uploading videos to YouTube to the pain of all the viewers. But that has held me back from doing more. But I really believe that if the consistency of it improved, that it would really snowball. But yeah, I don't really think that it's something that I would like to improve more than it already is. Like I put out videos that I enjoy doing with no obligation to do so. And I think that's what makes it enjoyable for me, is that it's like a artistic release of some sort, that I can like choose what I want to do here or there. And it's a project I can work on, and after a week it's done.
Yeah, it's you mentioned Adam Hansen in a different context, the work that he does with pro cycling around rider safety. As I've watched your YouTube channel and seen some of your interests, I mean, you've got the Vespa scooter, you seem to be a proficient mechanic, you're a professional chef, you built a very large altitude tent in your bedroom. I don't think we've seen that since it was built on the channel, unless I missed something. Is it still
No.
in there? Is it still in there?
I moved apartments since then actually, and
Okay.
I actually, in between that time I built the tent, and then I took the tent down and I converted the entire room to altitude. Like I sealed all the doors and windows and made the whole room altitude. And then I moved apartments, but I moved into the penthouse so that the ceiling's too high and there's too much volume to convert the whole room. So then I sort of ran into the point where I would have to get multiple generators to make it work, and then I just figured it was easier to go to altitude.
Yeah. So as I've kind of watched all of these projects, also at times you're eating 200 grams of oatmeal in a sitting, which that's remarkable in and of itself for a civilian. That's a lot of oatmeal to put down in one sitting, man. You have a lot of practice, I guess. But actually, it made me think of Adam Hansen because while he was a professional cyclist, I think he was running a software engineering business. He built a real estate empire. He was one of the most forward thinking people from technology and equipment point of view. He also started a company manufacturing his own shoes. Actually, I don't know, Adam. I'd love to have him on the podcast, and I'm hoping to have him on in the future. But I just saw a lot of similarities in terms of being a bit of a polymath with all of these deep interests that you seem to be quite good at.
Yeah, I think with Adam, cycling was really a hobby for him. He didn't need it. He didn't need a job, and I think that sort of obviously has enabled him to branch out into a lot of different things. And yeah, I mean, I've also tried to take the opportunity to do the same thing. Like, I've tried to pick things in my life that aren't detrimental to my performance or very little that I can justify so that I can make the most of living in Europe, or I can make the most of my short career in um like relative to the rest of my life, that I can make the most of the person I am and show people what my life is like, because in 20 years I'll probably be doing something completely different. And I wouldn't say I had an epiphany, but like I think like when I came in, I saw a lot of guys retire that I watched on TV before I became pro, and it made me realize that like it's probably going to be over really, really quickly. And yeah, that's what like got me into skiing, for example. Is like, how many times in my life after I retire am I going to be able to walk out my door onto a ski lift and ski and then ride all afternoon and then have dinner and a wine at some nice restaurant in Andorra? Like, it probably won't ever happen again.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah, well, I don't know what my life holds, but like it a lot of the time lately, particularly this off season, I've spent the entire time from October until February now in Andorra, and a lot of it is just a lot of just realizing how good my life has been lately, that I can ski on my recovery days and enjoy the sun and the snow and like enjoy where I actually live, because yeah, it's not always going to be like this.
What have you not tried yet outside of cycling that I feel like you've got some list, man? Like
Where do I start?
yeah,
One off
tell me about it.
season,
What do you want to try?
one off season, I got really into hiking, and I came up with the idea that I hated walking back downhill. Like, I just hated it, but I loved going up. So then I went down the paragliding rabbit hole for like 3 weeks or something, where I was like, maybe I should just buy a paragliding kit so that I can hike up and then just jump off the mountain and fly back home. And then I was like, oh, it's probably a terrible idea. Then I got into like, I'm going to buy a Ducati and like, I'm going to go to the track day on the weekend. And then I also realized that was probably a terrible idea. So then I bought a Vespa instead. But there's plenty of things that I just like, I would love to do it, but I just don't know if I can justify the risk of it and the consequences that it would have. But they're things that I would love to do after my career.